and who were the last to survive from a great land in the west that had sunk, leaving only the islands with the raths and circles and shrines of which Stonehenge was the greatest. There was no certainty, of course, in the legend that Gabinius had built an impregnable fortress over the forbidden cave and founded a line which Pict and Saxon, Dane and Norman were powerless to obliterate, or in the tacit assumption that
What
from
the
the flood
hell?
sprang the bold companion and
Server go
lieutenant of the
down?
Black Prince, whom Edward III created Baron of Northam. These things were not certain, yet they were often
The
told,
server
and in
crash?
truth the stonework of Northam Keep did look alarmingly like the masonry of Hadrian's Wall. As a child, Lord Northam had had peculiar dreams when sleeping in the older parts of the castle, and had acquired a constant habit of looking back through his memory for unfamiliar
Ah,
scenes and patterns and impressions which formed no part of his waking experience. He became a dreamer who found
probably a
life tame and
rollback from
unsatisfying, a searcher for strange
somebody
realms and
playing it.
relationships once familiar, yet lying nowhere
Admin
in the visible
rollback.
regions of Earth. Filled with a feeling that our tangible world is only an atom in a fabric vast and ominous, and that unknown domains press on and permeate the sphere of the known at every point, Northam in youth and young manhood drained in turn the founts of formal religion and occult mystery.
Because
Nowhere,
there's
however,
no
could
way
he
we've
find
been
ease
on
and
for
content,
3 hours.
and as he grew older, the staleness and limitations.
Oh, are you kidding me? And I think I lost my fucking internet. Nope, nope, nope. Well, that was kind of fucked up. It showed that I lost internet for a moment there, but that was kind of weird, I have to say. Uh,
Of life became more
my
and more
my
man-made.
internet
During
dropped
the
out for a
90s,
moment
he
there.
dabbled in Satanism, and at all times he devoured avidly any
That was
doctrine
kind of
or
weird.
theory which seemed
No,
to
don't
promise escape
fucking,
from the close vistas of science and the
no
dully unvaried
shaving.
laws of
What the
nature.
fuck?
Books like Ignatius Donnelly's chimerical account of Atlantis he
Am I
absorbed
back?
with
Can you
zest,
see me
and a
now?
dozen obscure precursors of Charles Fort enthralled him
We
with
should
their
be back.
vagaries.
We shouldn't
He
have
would
gone
travel
anywhere.
leagues to follow up a furtive village tale of abnormal wonder.
Can you see me? Am I here? Ah, that's annoying when that kind of shit happens, you know?
Manhood drained in turn the founts of formal religion and
But yeah, stream crashed. We're back. Everything good? Everybody still here? I don't know if anybody disappeared, but oh, I found a piece of crap. Hello? Yeah. So, uh, now we'll drop it on there. Take that off. Oh, Opa! Yeah, there, there. Take that out. Yeah, we're back. We're back. Sorry about that.
And once went into the desert of Araby to seek a
Not
nameless
entirely sure
city
what
of
the
faint
hell
report,
happened there.
which no man has ever beheld. There
My
was
internet kind of blipped off for
tantalizing fate
just
that
like a
somewhere
second.
an easy gate existed, which
It's
if one
weird.
found would admit him freely to those outer deeps whose echoes rattled so dimly at the back of his memory. It might be in the visible world, yet it might be only in his mind and soul. Perhaps he held within his own half-explored brain that cryptic link which would awaken him to elder and future lives in forgotten dimensions, which would bind him to the stars and to the infinities and eternities beyond them.
To infinity and beyond.
Thank you for listening today. If you'd like to support our work here at Horror Babble, be sure to check out the video description below, where you'll find links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages.
That was a very short story. The Tree on the Hill.
The Tree on the Hill by
Told ya.
H.P. Lovecraft and Dwayne W. Rimmel. 1. Southeast of Hampton, near
His
the tumultuous Salmon
collaborations
River
aren't
Gorge, is
as
a range of
good
steep, rocky hills which have defied all efforts of sturdy
as
homesteaders.
his solo
The
work.
canyons are too deep, and the slopes too precipitous to encourage anything save seasonal life.
I don't think anybody
The
redeemed
last
that
time I
to
visited
begin with.
Hampton, the region known as Hell's Acres was part of the Blue Mountain Forest Reserve. There are no roads linking this inaccessible locality with the outside world, and the hill folk will tell you that it is indeed a spot transplanted from His Satanic Majesty's front yard. There is a local superstition that the area is haunted, but by what or by whom, no one seems to know. Natives will not venture within its mysterious depths, for they believe the stories handed down to them by the Nez Perce Indians, who have shunned the region for untold generations, because, according to them, it is a playground of certain giant devils from the outside. These suggestive tales made me very curious. My first excursion and my
I've been
last
running
so
all
far
over here,
into
and I
those hills
still
occurred while
haven't found
Constantine
any
Funis and I were living in Hampton
4570
in the summer of
ammo.
1938. He was writing a treatise on Egyptian
How
mythology,
sad is
and I found
that?
myself alone much of the time, despite the fact that we shared a modest cabin on Beacon Street, within sight of the infamous pirate house built by Exeter Jones over 60 years ago. The morning of June 23rd found me walking in those oddly shaped hills which had, since 7 o'clock, seemed very ordinary indeed. I must have been about 7 miles south of Hampton before I noticed anything unusual. I was climbing a grassy ridge overlooking a particularly deep canyon when I came upon an area totally devoid of the usual bunch grass and greaseweed. It extended southward over numerous hills and valleys. At first I thought the spot had been burned over the previous fall, but upon examining the turf, I found no signs of a blaze. The nearby slopes and ravines looked terribly scarred and seared, as if some gigantic torch had blasted them, wiping away all vegetation. And yet there was no evidence of fire. I moved on over rich black soil in which no grass flourished. As I headed for the approximate center of this desolate area, I began to notice a strange silence. There were no larks, no rabbits, and even the insects seemed to have deserted the place. I gained the summit of a lofty knoll and tried to guess at the size of that bleak, inexplicable region. Then I saw the lone tree. It stood on a hill somewhat higher than its companions, and
You play
attracted
some
the eye because it
football?
was so utterly unexpected.
Are
I'd
you
seen no
ready for
trees
some
for miles.
football?
Thorn and hackberry bushes clustered the shallower ravines, but there had been no mature trees. Strange to find one standing on the crest of the hill. I crossed 2 steep canyons before I came to it, and a surprise awaited me. It was not a pine tree, nor a fir tree, nor a hackberry
Surprise!
tree. I had never in all my life seen one to compare with it, and I never have to this day, for which I am eternally thankful. More than anything, it resembled an oak. It had a huge, twisted trunk, fully a yard in diameter, and the large limbs began spreading outwards scarcely 7 feet from the ground. The leaves were round, and curiously alike in size and design. It might have been a tree painted on a canvas, but I will swear that it was real. I shall always know that it was real, despite what Theunis said later. I recall that I glanced at the sun and judged the time to be about 10 o'clock a.m., although I did not look at my watch. The day was becoming warm, and I
So
sat
he
for a
just
while in the
guessed.
welcome shade of the huge tree, and I regarded the rank grass that flourished beneath it. Another singular phenomenon when I remembered the bleak terrain through which I had passed. A wild maze of hills, ravines, and bluffs hemmed me in on all sides, although the rise on which I sat was rather higher than any other within miles. I looked far to the east, and I jumped to my feet, startled and amazed. Shimmering through a blue haze
Dead
of distance
bodies,
was a
dead
mountain.
bodies.
There is no other range of snow-capped peaks within 300 miles of Hampton, and I knew at this altitude that I shouldn't be seeing them at all.
Oh, all the
For
dead
several minutes I
bodies.
gazed at the marvel. Then I became drowsy. I lay in the rank grass beneath the tree. I unstrapped my camera, took off my hat, and relaxed, staring skyward through the green leaves. I closed my eyes. Then a curious phenomenon began to assail me. A vague, cloudy sort of vision, glimpsing or daydreaming seemingly without relevance to anything familiar. I thought I saw a great temple by a sea of ooze, where 3 suns gleamed in a pale red sky. The vast tomb or temple was an anomalous color, a nameless blue-violet shade. Large beasts flew in the cloudy sky, and I seemed to hear the pounding of their scaly wings. I went nearer the stone temple, and a huge doorway loomed in front of me. Within that portal were swirling shadows that seemed to dart and leer and try to snatch me inside that awful darkness. I thought I saw 3 flaming eyes in the shifting void of a doorway, and I
3
screamed
flaming
with mortal
eyes.
fear. In that noisome depth, I knew, lurked utter destruction, a living hell even worse than death. I screamed again. The vision faded. I saw the round leaves and the sane, earthly sky. I struggled to rise. I was trembling. Cold perspiration beaded my brow. I had a mad impulse to flee, run insanely from that
Oh,
sinister tree
well,
on the
it's
hill.
good we're not
But I
near
checked the absurd intuition
Jasper
and sat
anymore.
down, trying to collect my senses. Never had I dreamed anything so realistic, so horrifying. What had caused the vision? I had been reading several of Theunis's tomes of ancient Egypt. I mopped
Bad
my
zombie.
forehead and decided that it was time for lunch,
Down.
but I did not feel like eating. Then I had an inspiration. I would take a few snapshots of the tree for Theunis. They might shock him out of his habitual air of unconcern. Perhaps I would tell him about the dream. Opening my camera, I took 6 shots of the tree and every aspect of the landscape as seen from the tree. Also, I included one of the gleaming, snow-crested peaks. I might want to return, and these photos would help. Folding the camera, I returned to my cushion of soft grass. Had that spot beneath the tree a certain alien enchantment? I know that I was reluctant to leave it. I gazed upward at the curious round leaves. I closed my eyes. A breeze stirred the branches, and their whispered music lulled me into tranquil oblivion. And suddenly I saw again the pale red sky and the 3 suns, the land of 3 shadows. Again, the great temple came into view. I seemed to be floating on the air, a disembodied spirit exploring the wonders of a mad, multi-dimensional world. The
Yeah, we're
temple's
gonna follow
oddly angled
this
cornices
road.
frightened me, and I knew that this place was one that no man on earth had ever seen in his wildest dreams. Again, the vast doorway yawned before me, and I was sucked within that black, writhing cloud. I seemed to be staring at space unlimited. I saw a void beyond my vocabulary to describe, a dark, bottomless gulf teeming with nameless shapes and entities, things of madness and delirium, as tenuous as a mist from Shambhala. My soul shrank. I was terribly afraid. I screamed, and felt that I would soon go mad. Then in my dream I ran and ran in a fever of utter terror, but I did not know what I was running from. I left that hideous temple and that
And
hellish
I
void, yet I
ran,
knew I
I
must,
ran
barring
so
some miracle,
far
return.
away.
At last my eyes flew open. I was not beneath the tree. I was sprawled on a rocky slope, my clothing torn and disordered. My hands were bleeding. I stood up, pain stabbing through me. I recognized the spot, the ridge where I had first seen the blasted area. I must have walked miles unconscious. The tree was not in sight, and I was glad. Even the knees of my trousers were torn, as if I had crawled part of the way. I glanced at the sun. Late afternoon. Where had I been? I snatched out my watch. It had stopped at 10:34. 2. So you have the snapshots? Eunice drawled. I met his grey eyes across the breakfast table. 3 days had slipped by since my return from Hell's Acres. I had told him about the dream beneath the tree, and he had laughed. Yes, I replied. They came last night. Haven't had a chance to open them yet. Give them a good, careful study. If they aren't all failures, perhaps you'll change your mind. Eunice smiled, sipped his coffee. I gave him the unopened envelope, and he quickly broke the seal and withdrew the pictures. He glanced at the first one, and the smile faded from his leonine face. He crushed out his cigarette. My God, man, look at this. I seized the glossy rectangle. It was the first picture of the tree, taken at a distance of 50 feet or so. The cause of Theunus's excitement escaped me. There it was, standing boldly on the hill, while below it grew the jungle of grass where I had lain. In the distance were my snow-capped mountains. There you are, I cried, the proof of my story. Look at it, Theunus snapped. The shadows. There are 3 for every rock, bush, and tree. He was right. Below the tree, spread in fan-like incongruity, lay 3 overlapping shadows. Suddenly, I realized that the picture held an abnormal and inconsistent element. The leaves on the thing were too lush for the work of sane nature, while the trunk was bulged and knotted in the most abhorrent shapes. Theunus dropped the picture on the table. There is something wrong, I muttered. The tree I saw didn't look as repulsive as that. Are you sure? Theunus grated. The fact is, you may have seen many things not recorded on this film. It shows more than I saw. That's the point. There is something damnably out of place in this landscape. Something I can't understand. The tree seems to suggest a thought beyond my grasp. It is too misty, too uncertain, too unreal to be natural. He rapped nervous fingers on the table. He snatched the remaining films and shuffled through them rapidly. I reached for the snapshot he had dropped and sensed a touch of bizarre uncertainty and strangeness as my eyes absorbed its every detail. The flowers and weeds pointed at varying angles, while some of the grass grew in the most bewildering fashion. The tree seemed too veiled and clouded to be readily distinguished, but I noted the huge limbs and the half-bent flower stems that were ready to fall over, yet did not fall, and the many overlapping shadows. They were, altogether, very disquieting shadows, too long or short when compared to the stems they fell below to give one a feeling of comfortable normality. The landscape hadn't shocked me the day of my visit. There was a dark familiarity and mocking suggestion in it, something tangible yet distant as the stars beyond the galaxy. The Eunice came back to earth. Did you mention 3 sons in your dreaming orgy? I nodded, frankly puzzled. Then it dawned on me. My fingers trembled slightly as I stared at the picture again. My dream, of course. The others are just like it, the Eunice said. That same uncertainness, that suggestion. I should be able to catch the mood of the thing, see it in its real
Oh,
light,
that's
but
cool.
it is too... Perhaps later I shall find out, if I look at it long enough. We sat in silence for some time. A thought came to me suddenly, prompted by a strange, inexplicable longing to visit the tree again. Let's make an excursion. I think I can take you there in half a day. You'd better stay away, replied the Eunice thoughtfully. I doubt if you could find the place again if you wanted to. Nonsense, I replied. Surely with these photos to guide us. Did you see any familiar landmarks in them? His observation was uncanny. After looking through the remaining snaps carefully, I had to admit that there were none. The Eunice muttered under his breath and drew viciously on his cigarette. A perfectly normal, or nearly so, picture of a spot apparently dropped from nowhere. Seeing mountains at this low altitude is preposterous. But wait. He sprang from the chair as a hunted animal and raced from the room. I could hear him moving about in our makeshift library, cursing volubly. Before long, he reappeared with an old, leather-bound volume. The Eunice opened it reverently and peered over the odd characters. What do you call that? I inquired. This is an early English translation of the Chronicle of Nat, written by Rudolf Jürgler, a German mystic and alchemist who borrowed some of his lore from Hermes Trismegistus, the ancient Egyptian sorcerer. There's a passage here that might interest you. Might make you understand why this business
Didn't find
is
any
even
gloves
further
either.
from the natural than you suspect. Listen. So, in the year of the Black Goat, there came unto Nath a shadow that should not be on earth, and that had no form known to the eyes of earth. And it fed on the souls of men, they that it gnawed being lured and blinded with dreams till the horror and the endless night lay upon them. Nor did they see that which gnawed them, for the shadow took false shapes that men know or dream of, and only freedom seemed waiting in the land of the 3 sons. But it was told by priests of the old book that he who could see the shadow's true shape and live after the seeing might shun its doom and send it back to the starless gulf of its spawning. This none could do save through the gem. Wherefore did Khan Nefer, the high priest, keep that gem sacred in the temple. And when it was lost with Freen, he who braved the horror and was never seen more, there was weeping in that. Yet did the shadow depart sated at last, nor shall it hunger again till the cycles roll back to the year of the Black Goat. The Eunice paused while I stared, bewildered. Finally, he spoke. Now, Single, I suppose you can guess how all this links up. There is no need of going deep into the primal lore behind this business. But I may as well tell you that according to the old legends, this is the so-called Year of the Black Goat, when certain horrors from the
Year
fathomless
of the
outside are
Black
supposed to
Goat.
visit the earth and do infinite harm. We don't know how they'll be manifest, but there's reason to think that strange mirages and hallucinations will be mixed up in the matter. I don't like the things run up in the story or the pictures. It may be pretty bad, and I warn you to look out. But first I must try to do what old Jurgla says, to see if I can glimpse the matter as it is. Fortunately, the old gem he mentions has been rediscovered. I know where I can get at it. We must use it on the photographs and see what we see. It's more or less like a lens or prism, though one can't take photographs with it. Someone of peculiar sensitiveness might look through and sketch what he sees. There's a bit of danger, and the looker may have his consciousness shaken a trifle, for the real shape of the shadow isn't pleasant and doesn't belong on this earth. But it would be a lot more dangerous not to do anything about it. Meanwhile, if you value your life and sanity, keep away from that hill. There's a tree on it. I was more bewildered than ever. How can there be organized beings from the outside in our midst? I cried. How do we know that such things exist? You reason in terms of this tiny earth, Eunice said. Surely you don't think that the world is a rule for measuring the universe. There are entities we never dream of, floating under our very noses. Modern science is thrusting back the borderland of the unknown, and proving that the mystics were not so far off the track. Suddenly, I knew that I did not want to look at the picture again. I wanted to destroy it. I wanted to run from it. Eunice was suggesting something beyond. A trembling, cosmic fear gripped me and drew me away from the hideous picture, for I was afraid I would recognize some object in it. I glanced at my friend. He was poring over the ancient book, a strange expression on his face. He sat up straight. Let's call the thing off for today. I'm tired of this endless guessing and wondering. I must get the loan of the gem from the museum where it is, and do what is to be done. As you say, I replied. Will you have to go to Croydon? He nodded. Then we'll both go home, I said decisively. 3. I need not chronicle the events of the fortnight that followed. With me they formed a constant and enervating struggle between a mad longing to return to the cryptic tree of dreams and freedom, and a frenzied dread of that selfsame thing, and all connected with it. That I did not return is perhaps less a matter of my own will than a matter of pure chance. Meanwhile, I knew that Eunice was desperately active in some investigation of the strangest nature, something which included a mysterious motor trip and a return under circumstances of the greatest secrecy. By hints over the telephone, I was made to understand that he had somewhere borrowed the obscure and primal object mentioned in the ancient volume as the gem, and that he was busy devising the means of applying it to the photographs I had left with him. He spoke fragmentarily of refraction, polarization, and unknown angles of space and time, and indicated that he was building a kind of box or camera obscura for the study of the curious snapshots with the gem's aid. It was on the 16th day that I received the startling message from the hospital in Croydon. Eunice was there and wanted to see me at once. He had suffered some odd sort of seizure, being found prone and unconscious by friends who found their way into his house after hearing certain cries of mortal agony and fear. Though still weak and helpless, he had now regained his senses and seemed frantic to tell me something and have me perform certain important duties. This much the hospital informed me over the wire, and within half an hour I was at my friend's bedside, marveling at the inroads which worry and tension had made on his features in so brief a time. His first act was to move away the nurses in order to speak in utter confidence. Single, I saw it. His voice was strained and husky. You must destroy them all, those pictures. I sent it back by seeing it, but the pictures had better go. That tree will never be seen on the hill again. At least I hope not, till thousands of eons bring back the year of the black goat. You're safe now. Mankind is safe. He paused, breathing heavily, and continued. Take the gem out of the apparatus and put it in the safe. You know the combination. It must go back where it came from. But there's a time when it may be needed to save the world. They won't let me leave here yet, but I can rest if I know it's safe. Don't look through the box as it is. It would fix you as it's fixed me. And burn those damned photographs, the one in the box and the others. But Eunice was exhausted now, and the nurses advanced and motioned me away as he leaned back and closed his eyes. In another half hour I was at his house and looking curiously at the long black box on the library table beside the overturned chair. Scattered papers blew about in a breeze from the open window, and close to the box I recognized with a queer sensation the envelope of pictures I had taken. It required only a moment for me to examine the box and detach at one end my earliest picture of the tree, and at the other end a strange bit of amber-colored crystal, cut in devious angles impossible to classify. The touch of the glass fragment seemed curiously warm and electric, and I could scarcely bear to put it out of sight in Thunis's wall safe. The snapshot I handled with a disconcerting mixture of emotions. Even after I'd replaced it in the envelope with the rest, I had a morbid longing to save it and gloat over it and rush out and up the hill toward its original. Peculiar line arrangements sprang out of its details to assault and puzzle my memory. Pictures behind pictures, secrets lurking in half-familiar shapes. But a saner contrary instinct, operating at the same time, gave me the vigor and avidity of unplaceable fear as I hastily kindled a fire in the grate and watched the problematic envelope burn to ashes. Somehow I felt that the earth had been purged of a horror on whose brink I had trembled, and which was none the less monstrous because I did not know what it was. Of the source of Thunis's terrific shock, I could form no coherent guess, nor did I dare to think too closely about it. It is notable that I did not at any time have the least impulse to look through the box before removing the gem and photograph. What was shown in the picture by the antique crystal's lens or prism-like power was not, I felt curiously certain, anything that a normal brain ought to be called upon to face. Whatever it was, I had myself been close to it, had been completely under the spell of its allurement, as it brooded on that remote hill in the form of a tree and an unfamiliar landscape. And I did not wish to know what I had so narrowly escaped. Would that my ignorance might have remained complete. I could sleep better at night. As it was, my eye was arrested before I left the room by the pile of scattered papers rustling on the table beside the black box. All but one were blank, but that one bore a crude drawing in pencil. Suddenly recalling what Eunice had once said about sketching the horror revealed by the gem, I strove to turn away, but sheer curiosity defeated my sane design. Looking again almost furtively, I observed the nervous haste of the strokes and the unfinished edge left by the sketcher's terrified seizure. Then, in a burst of perverse boldness, I looked squarely at the dark and forbidden design, and fell in a faint. I shall never describe fully what I saw. After a time I regained my senses, thrust the sheet into the dying fire, and staggered out through the quiet streets to my home. I thanked God that I had not looked through the crystal at the photograph, and prayed fervently that I might forget the drawing's terrible hint of what Eunice had beheld. Since then, I have never been quite the same. Even the fairest scenes have seemed to hold some vague, ambiguous hint of the nameless blasphemies which may underlie them and form their masquerading
Blasphemies.
And yet the sketch was so slight, so little indicative of all that Eunice, to judge from his guarded accounts later on, must have discerned. Only a few basic elements of the landscape were in the thing. For the most part, a cloudy, exotic-looking vapor dominated the view. Every object that might have been familiar was seen to be part of something vague and unknown and altogether unterrestrial, something infinitely vaster than any human eye could grasp, and infinitely alien, monstrous and hideous as guessed from the fragment within range. Where I had, in the landscape itself, seen the twisted, half-sentient tree, there was here visible only a gnarled, terrible hand or talon with fingers or feelers shockingly distended.
Cook some sardines and get high.
Or in the spectator's direction.
Oh.
And squarely below the writhing, bloated digits, I thought I saw an outline in the grass where a man had lain. But the sketch was hasty, and I could not be sure. Thank you for listening today. If you'd like to support our work here at Horror Babble, be sure to... We hope you enjoy this one. The Alchemist by H.P. Lovecraft. High up, crowning the grassy summit of a swelling mound whose sides are wooded near the base with the gnarled trees of the primeval forest, stands the old chateau of my ancestors. For centuries, its lofty battlements have frowned down upon the wild and rugged countryside about, serving as a home and stronghold for the proud house whose honored line is older even than the moss-grown castle walls. These ancient turrets, stained by the storms of generations and crumbling under the slow yet mighty pressure of time, formed in the ages of feudalism one of the most dreaded and formidable fortresses in old France. From its machicolated parapets and mounted battlements, barons, counts, and even kings have been defied, yet never had its spacious halls resounded to the footsteps of the invader. But since those glorious years, all is changed. A poverty but little above the level of dire want, together with a pride of name that forbids its alleviation by the pursuits of commercial life, have prevented the scions of our line from maintaining their estates in pristine splendor, and the falling stones of the walls, the overgrown vegetation in the parks, the dry and dusty moat, the ill-paved courtyards and toppling towers without, as well as the sagging floors, the worm-eaten wainscots, and the faded tapestries within, all tell a gloomy tale of fallen grandeur. As the ages passed, first one, then another of the four great turrets were left to ruin, until at last but a single tower housed the sadly reduced descendants of the once mighty lords of the estate. It was in one of the vast and gloomy chambers of this remaining tower that I, Antoine, last of the unhappy and accursed Comte de C, first saw the light of day 90 long years ago. Within these walls, and amongst the dark and shadowy forest, the wild ravines and grottos of the hillside below, were spent the first years of my troubled life.
Cooked sardines.
My father had been killed at the age of 32, a month before I was born, by the fall of a stone somehow dislodged from one of the deserted parapets of the castle. My mother having died at my birth, my care and education devolved solely upon one remaining servitor, an old and trusted man of considerable intelligence, whose name I remember as Pierre. I was an only child, and the lack of companionship which this fact
it's a good thing we decided to
care exercised by my aged guardian,
light a fire and hang out in here tonight, because it's a raining,
scattered here and there upon the
storming out
around the base of the hill. At the time, Pierre said that this restriction was imposed upon me because my noble birth placed me above association with such plebeian company. Now I know that its real object was to keep from my ears the idle tales of the dread curse upon our line, that were nightly told and magnified by the simple tenantry as they conversed in hushed accents in the glow of their cottage hearths. Thus isolated and thrown upon my own resources, I spent the hours of my childhood in poring over the ancient tomes that filled the shadow-haunted library of the chateau, and in roaming without aim through the perpetual dusk of the spectral wood that clothed the side of the hill near its foot. It was perhaps an effect of such surroundings that my mind early acquired a shade of melancholy. Those studies and pursuits which partake of the dark and occult in nature most strongly claimed my attention. Of my own race, I was permitted to learn singularly little, yet what small knowledge of it I was able to gain seemed to depress me much. Perhaps it was at first only the manifest reluctance of my old preceptor to discuss with me my paternal ancestry that gave rise to the terror which I ever felt at the mention of my great house. Yet, as I grew out of childhood, I was able to piece together disconnected fragments of discourse let slip from the unwilling tongue which had begun to falter in approaching senility, that had a sort of relation to a certain circumstance which I had always deemed strange, but which now became dimly terrible. The circumstance to which I allude is the early age at which all the comtes of my line had met their end. Whilst I had hitherto considered this but a natural attribute of a family of short-lived men, I afterward pondered long upon these premature deaths, and began to connect them with the wanderings of the old man, who often spoke of a curse which for centuries had prevented the lives of the holders of my title from much exceeding the span of 32 years. Upon my 21st birthday, the aged Pierre gave to me a family document, which he said had, for many generations, been handed down from father to son, and continued by each possessor. Its contents were of the most startling nature, and its perusal confirmed the gravest of my apprehensions. At this time, my belief in the supernatural was firm, deep-seated, else I should have dismissed with scorn the incredible narrative unfolded before my eyes. The paper carried me back to the days of the 13th century, and the old castle in which I sat had been a feared and impregnable fortress. It told of a certain ancient man who had once dwelt on our estates, a person of no
An
small
ancient man.
though little above the rank of peasant, by name Michel, usually designated by the surname of Mouvet, the Evil, on account of his sinister reputation. He had studied beyond the custom of his kind, seeking such things as the philosopher's stone or the elixir of eternal life, and was reputed wise in the terrible secrets of black magic and alchemy. Michel Mouvet had one son, named Charles, a youth as proficient as himself in the hidden arts, and who had therefore been called Le Sorcier, or the Wizard. This pair, shunned by all honest folk, was suspected of the most hideous practices. Old Michel was said to have burned his wife alive as a sacrifice to the devil, and the unaccountable disappearances of many small peasant children were laid at the dreaded door of these two. Yet, through the dark natures of the father and the son, ran one redeeming ray of humanity. The evil old man loved his offspring with fierce intensity, whilst the youth had for his parent a more than filial affection. One night, the castle on the hill was thrown into the wildest confusion by the vanishment of young Godfrey, son to Henri the Comte. A searching party, headed by the frantic father, invaded the cottage of the sorcerers, and there came upon old Michel Mouvet, busy over a huge and violently boiling cauldron. Without a certain cause, in the ungoverned madness of fury and despair, the Comte laid hands on the aged wizard, and ere he released his murderous hold, his victim was no more. Meanwhile, joyful servants were proclaiming the finding of young Godfrey in a distant and unused chamber of the great edifice, telling too late that poor Michel had been killed in vain. As the Comte and his associates turned away from the lowly abode of the alchemists, the form of Charles Le Sorcier appeared through the trees. The excited chatter of the menials standing about told him what had occurred, yet he seemed at first unmoved at his father's fate. Then, slowly advancing to meet the Comte, he pronounced in dull yet terrible accents the curse that ever afterward haunted the house of C. May never a noble of thy murderous line survive to reach a greater age than thine, spake he, when, suddenly leaping backwards into the black wood, he drew from his tunic a phial of colourless liquid, which he threw into the face of his father's slayer, as he disappeared behind the inky curtain of the night. The Comte died without utterance, and was buried the next day, but little more than 32 years from the hour of his birth. No trace of the assassin could be found, though relentless bands of peasants scoured the neighbouring woods and the meadowland around the hill. Thus time and the want of a reminder dulled the memory of the curse in the minds of the late Comte's family, so that when Godfrey, innocent cause of the whole tragedy and now bearing the title, was killed by an arrow whilst hunting at the age of 32, there were no thoughts save those of grief at his demise. But when, years afterward, the next young Comte, Robert by name, was found dead in a nearby field from no apparent cause, the peasants told in whispers that their seigneur had but lately passed his 32nd birthday, and surprised by early death. Louis, son to Robert, was found drowned in the moat at the same fateful age, and thus down through the centuries ran the ominous chronicle. Henri's, Robert's, Antoine's, and Armand's snatched from happy and virtuous lives when little below the age of their unfortunate ancestor at his murder. That I had left at most but 11 years of further existence was made certain to me by the words which I read.
It was murder,
previously held at small value, now became dearer to me each day, as I delved deeper and deeper into the mysteries of the hidden world of black magic. Isolated as I was, Modern science had produced no impression upon me, and I labored as in the Middle Ages, as rapt as had been old Michel and young Charles themselves, in the acquisition of demonological and alchemical learning. Yet read as I might, in no manner could I account for the strange curse upon my line. In unusually rational moments, I would even go so far as to seek a natural explanation, attributing the early deaths of my ancestors to the sinister Charles Le Sorcier and his heirs. Yet having
The
found upon
Sorcier.
careful inquiry that there were no known descendants of the alchemist, I would fall back to occult studies, and once more endeavor to find a spell that would release my house from its terrible burden. Upon one thing I was absolutely resolved. I should never wed, for since no other branches of my family were in existence, I might thus end the curse with myself. As I drew near the age of 30, old Pierre was called to the land beyond. Alone I buried him beneath the stones of the courtyard, about which he had loved to wander in life. Thus was I left to ponder on myself as the only human creature within the great fortress, and in my utter solitude my mind began to cease its vain protest against the impending doom, to become almost reconciled to the fate which so many of my ancestors had met. Much of my time was now occupied in the exploration of the ruined and abandoned halls and towers of the old chateau, which in youth fear had caused me to shun, and some of which, old Pierre had once told me, had not been trodden by human foot for over 4 centuries. Strange and awesome were many of the objects I encountered. Furniture, covered by the dust of ages and crumbling with the rot of long dampness, met my eyes. Cobwebs in a profusion never before seen by me were spun everywhere, and huge bats flapped their bony and uncanny wings on all sides of the otherwise untenanted gloom. Of my exact age, even down to days and hours, I kept a most careful record, for each movement of the pendulum of the massive clock in the library told off so much more of my doomed existence. At length I approached that time which I had so long viewed with apprehension. Since most of my ancestors have been seized some little while before they reached the exact age of Comte Henri at his end, I was every moment on the watch for the coming of the unknown death. In what strange form the curse should overtake me I knew not, but I was resolved at least that it should not find me a cowardly or a passive victim. With new vigor, I applied myself to my examination of the old chateau and its contents. It was upon one of the longest of all my excursions of discovery in the deserted portion of the castle, less than a week before that fatal hour which I felt must mark the utmost limit of my stay on earth, beyond which I could have not even the slightest hope of continuing to draw breath, that I came upon the culminating event of my whole life. I had spent the better part of the morning in climbing up and down half-ruined staircases in one of the most dilapidated of the ancient turrets. As the afternoon progressed, I sought the lower levels, descending into what appeared to be either a medieval place of confinement or a more recently excavated storehouse for gunpowder. As I slowly traversed the niter-encrusted passageway at the foot of the last staircase, the paving became very damp, and soon I saw by the light of my flickering torch that a blank, water-stained wall impeded my journey. Turning to retrace my steps, my eye fell upon a small trapdoor with a ring, which lay directly beneath my feet. Pausing, I succeeded with difficulty in raising it, whereupon there was revealed a black aperture, exhaling noxious fumes which caused my torch to sputter, and disclosing in the unsteady glare the top of a flight of stone steps. As soon as the torch, which I lowered into the repellent depths, burned freely and steadily, I commenced my descent. The steps were many, and led to a narrow stone-flagged passage which I knew must be far underground. The passage proved of great length, and terminated in a massive oaken door, dripping with the moisture of the place, and stoutly resisting all my attempts to open it. Ceasing after a time my efforts in this direction, I had proceeded back some distance toward the steps, when there suddenly fell to my experience one of the most profound and maddening shocks capable of reception by the human mind. Without warning, I heard the heavy door behind me creak slowly open upon its rusted hinges. My immediate sensations are incapable of analysis. To be confronted in a place as thoroughly deserted as I had deemed the old castle, with evidence of the presence of man or spirit, produced in my brain a horror of the most acute description. When at last I turned and faced the seat of the sound, my eyes must have started from their orbits at the sight that they beheld. There, in the ancient Gothic doorway, stood a human figure. It was that of a man clad in a skull cap and long medieval tunic of dark color. His long hair and flowing beard were of a terrible and intense black hue, and of incredible profusion. His forehead, high beyond the usual dimensions, his cheeks deep sunken and heavily lined with wrinkles, and his hands, long, claw-like and gnarled, were of such a deathly, marble-like whiteness as I have never elsewhere seen in man. His figure, lean to the proportions of a skeleton, was strangely bent and almost lost within the voluminous folds of his peculiar garment. But strangest of all were his eyes, twin caves of abysmal blackness, profound in expression of understanding, yet inhuman in degree of wickedness. These were now fixed upon me, piercing my soul with their hatred, and rooting me to the spot whereon I stood. At last, the figure spoke in a rumbling voice that chilled me through with its dull hollowness and latent malevolence. The language in which the discourse was clothed was that debased form of Latin in use amongst the more learned men of the Middle Ages, and made familiar to me by my prolonged researches into the works of the old alchemists and demonologists. The apparition spoke of the curse which had hovered over my house, told me of my coming end, dwelt on the wrong perpetrated by my ancestor against old Michel Mouvet, and gloated over the revenge of Charles Le Sorcier. He told how the young Charles had escaped into the night, returning in after years to kill Godfrey the heir with an arrow, just as he approached the age which had been his father's at his assassination. How he had secretly returned to the estate and established himself, unknown, in the even then deserted subterranean chamber, whose doorway now framed the hideous narrator. How he had seized Robert, son of Godfrey, in a field, forced poison down his throat, and left him to die at the age of 32, thus maintaining the foul provisions of his vengeful curse. At this point I was left to imagine the solution of the greatest mystery of all, how the curse had been fulfilled since that time when Charles Le Sorcier must in the course of nature have died. But the man digressed into an account of the deep alchemical studies of the two wizards, father and son, speaking most particularly of the researches of Charles Le Sorcier concerning the elixir which should grant to him who partook of it eternal life and youth. His enthusiasm had seemed for the moment to remove from his terrible eyes the hatred that had at first so haunted them. But suddenly the fiendish glare returned, and with a shocking sound like the hissing of a serpent, the stranger raised a glass phial with the evident intent of ending my life, as had Charles Le Sorcier 600 years before ended that of my ancestor. Prompted by some preserving instinct of self-defense, I broke through the spell that had hitherto held me immovable, and flung my now dying torch at the creature who menaced my existence. I heard the phial break harmlessly against the stones of the passage, as the tunic of the strange man caught fire and lit the horrid scene with a ghastly radiance. The shriek of fright
Oh,
and
that's one way to
malice
break a
emitted by the
curse.
would-be assassin proved too much for my already shaken nerves, and I fell prone upon the slimy floor in a total faint. When at last my senses returned, all was frightfully dark, and my mind, remembering what had occurred, shrank from the idea of beholding more. Yet curiosity overmastered all. Who, I asked myself, was this man of evil, and how came he within the castle walls? Why should he seek to avenge the death of poor Michel Mouvet? And how had the curse been carried on through all the long centuries since the time of Charles Le Sorcier? The dread of years was lifted from my shoulders, for I knew that he whom I had felled was the source of all my danger from the curse. And now that I was free, I burned with the desire to learn more of the sinister thing which had haunted my line for centuries, and made of my own youth one long-continued nightmare. Determined upon further exploration, I felt in my pockets for flint and steel, and lit the unused torch which I had with me. First of all, the new light revealed the distorted and blackened form of the mysterious stranger. The hideous eyes were now closed. Disliking the sight, I turned away and entered the chamber beyond the Gothic door. Here, I found what seemed much like an alchemist's laboratory. In one corner was an immense pile of a shining yellow metal that sparkled gorgeously in the light of the torch. It may have been gold, but I did not pause to examine it, for I was strangely affected by that which I had undergone. At the farther end of the apartment was an opening leading out into one of the many wild ravines of the dark hillside forest. Filled with wonder, yet now realizing how the man had obtained access to the chateau, I proceeded to return. I had intended to pass by the remains of the stranger with averted face, but as I approached the body, I seemed to hear emanating from it a faint sound, as though life were not yet wholly extinct. Aghast, I turned to examine the charred and shriveled figure on the floor. Then all at once, the horrible eyes, blacker even than the seared face in which they were set, opened wide with an expression which I was unable to interpret. The cracked lips tried to frame words which I could not well understand. Once I caught the name of Charles Le Sorcier, and again I fancied that the words years and curse issued from the twisted mouth. Still, I was at a loss to gather the purport of his disconnected speech. At my evident ignorance of his meaning, the pitchy eyes once more flashed malevolently at me, until, helpless as I saw my opponent to be, I trembled as I watched him. Suddenly the wretch, animated with his last burst of strength, raised his hideous head from the damp and sunken pavement. Then, as I remained, paralyzed with fear, he found his voice, and in his dying breath screamed forth those words which have ever afterward haunted my days and my nights. "Fool!" he shrieked. "Can you not guess my secret? Have you no brain whereby you may recognize the will which has through 6 long centuries fulfilled the dreadful curse upon your house? Have I not told you of the great elixir of eternal life? Know you not how the secret of alchemy was solved? I tell you, it is I, that have lived for 600 years to maintain my revenge, for I am Charles Le Sorcier."
Wait, what?
Thank you for listening today. If you'd like to support our work here at Horror...
So he was revenging himself against his own family?
Not all of the few remaining inhabitants of Dahlbergen, that dismal little village in the Ramapo Mountains, believe that my uncle, old Dominie van der Hoof, is really dead. Some of them believe he is suspended somewhere between heaven and hell because of the old sexton's curse. If it had not been for that old magician, he might still be preaching in the little damp church across the moor. After what has happened to me in Dahlbergen, I can almost share the opinion of the villagers. I am not sure that my uncle is dead, but I am very sure that he is not alive upon this earth. There is no doubt that the old sexton buried him once, but he is not in that grave now. I can almost feel him behind me as I write, impelling me to tell the truth about those strange happenings in Dahlbergen so many years ago. It was the 4th day of October when I arrived at Dahlbergen in answer to a summons. The letter was from a former member of my uncle's congregation, who wrote that the old man had passed away, and that there should be some small estate which I, as his only living relative, might inherit. Having reached the secluded little hamlet by a wearying series of changes on branch railways, I found my way to the grocery store of Mark Haynes, the writer of the letter. and he, leading me into a stuffy back room, told me a peculiar tale concerning Dominie Vanderhoof's death. "You should be careful, Hoffman," Baines told me, "when you meet that old sexton, Abel Foster. He's in league with the devil sure as you're alive. 'Twa'n't 2 weeks ago Sam Pryor, when he passed the old graveyard, heard him mumbling to the dead there. 'Twa'n't right he should talk that way, and Sam does vow that there was a voice answered him, a kind of half-voice, hollow and muffled like, as though it come out of the ground. There's others, too, as could tell you about seeing him standing afore old Dominie Slot's grave, that one right agin the church wall, a-wringing his hands and a-talking to the moss of the tombstone as though it was the old Dominie himself." Old Foster, Haynes said, had come to Dahlbergen about 10 years before, and had been immediately engaged by Vanderhoof to take care of the damp stone church, at which most of the villagers worshipped. No one but Vanderhoof seemed to like him, for his presence brought a suggestion, almost of the uncanny. He would sometimes stand by the door when the people came to church, and the men would coldly return his servile bow, while the women brushed past in haste, holding their skirts aside to avoid touching him. He could be seen on weekdays cutting the grass in the cemetery and tending the flowers around the graves, now and then crooning and muttering to himself. And few failed to notice the particular attention he paid to the grave of the Reverend Gilliam Slot, first pastor of the church in 1701. It was not long after Foster's establishment as a village fixture that disaster began to lower. First came the failure of the mountain mine where most of the men worked. The vein of iron had given out, and many of the people moved away to better localities, while those who had large holdings of land in the vicinity took to farming and managed to wrest a meager living from the rocky hillsides. Then came the disturbances in the church. It was whispered about that the Reverend Johannes Vanderhoof had made a compact with the devil and was preaching his word in the house of God. His sermons had become weird and grotesque, redolent with sinister things which the ignorant people of Dahlbergen did not understand. He transported them back over ages of fear and superstition, to regions of hideous, unseen spirits, and peopled their fancy with night-haunting ghouls. One by one, the congregation dwindled, while the elders and deacons vainly pleaded with Vanderhoof to change the subject of his sermons. Though the old man continually promised to comply, he seemed to be enthralled by some higher power, which forced him to do its will.
Scare us.
A giant in stature, Johannes Vanderhoof was known to be weak and timid at heart, yet even when threatened with expulsion, he continued his eerie sermons, until scarcely a handful of people remained to listen to him on Sunday morning. Because of weak finances, it was found impossible to call a new pastor, and before long not one of the villagers dared venture near the church, or the parsonage which adjoined it. Everywhere there was fear of those spectral wraiths with whom Vanderhoof was apparently in league. My uncle, Mark Haynes told me, had continued to live in the parsonage because there was no one with sufficient courage to tell him to move out of it. No one ever saw him again, but lights were visible in the parsonage at night, and were even glimpsed in the church from time to time. It was whispered about the town that Vanderhoof preached regularly in the church every Sunday morning, aware that his congregation was no longer there to listen. He had only the old sexton, who lived in the basement of the church, to take care of him, and Foster made a weekly visit to what remained of the business section of the village to buy provisions. He no longer bowed servilely to everyone he met, but instead seemed to harbor a demoniac and ill-concealed hatred. He spoke to no one except as was necessary to make his purchases, and glanced from left to right out of evil-filled eyes as he walked the street with his cane tapping the uneven pavements. Bent and shriveled with extreme age, his presence could actually be felt by anyone near him. So powerful was that personality which, said the townspeople, had made Vanderhoof accept the devil as his master. No person in Dahlbergen doubted that Abel Foster was at the bottom of all the town's ill luck, but not a one dared lift a finger against him, or could even approach him without a tremor of fear. His name, as well as Vanderhoof's, was never mentioned aloud. Whenever the matter of the church across the moor was discussed, it was in whispers, and if the conversation chanced to be nocturnal, The whisperers would keep glancing over their shoulders to make sure that nothing shapeless or sinister crept out of the darkness to bear witness to their words.
Ooh.
The churchyard continued to be kept just as green and beautiful as when the church was in use,
Corrupt
and the
man
flowers
of the
near the graves in
cloth.
the cemetery were tended just as carefully as in times gone by. The old sexton could occasionally be seen working there, as if still being paid for his services, and those who dared venture near said that he maintained a continual conversation with the devil and with those spirits which lurked within the graveyard walls. One morning, Haynes went on to say, Foster was seen digging a grave where the steeple of the church throws its shadow in the afternoon before the sun goes down behind the mountain and puts the entire village in semi-twilight. Later, the church bell, silent for months, tolled solemnly for a half-hour, and at sundown, those who were watching from a distance saw Foster bring a coffin from the parsonage on a wheelbarrow, dump it into the grave with slender ceremony, and replace the earth in the hole. The sexton came to the village the next morning, ahead of his usual weekly schedule, and in much better spirits than was customary. He seemed willing to talk, remarking that Vanderhoof had died the day before, and that he had buried his body beside that of Dominie Slot near the church wall. He smiled from time to time, and rubbed his hands in an untimely and unaccountable glee. It was apparent that he took a perverse and diabolic delight in Vanderhoof's death. The villagers were conscious of an added uncanniness in his presence, and avoided him as much as they could. With Vanderhoof gone, they felt more insecure than ever, for the old sexton was now free to cast his worst spells over the town from the church across the moor. Muttering something in a tongue which no one understood, Foster made his way back along the road over the swamp. It was then, it seems, that Mark Haynes remembered having heard Dominie Vanderhoof speak of me as his nephew. Haynes accordingly sent for me, in the hope that I might know something which would clear up the mystery of my uncle's last years. I assured my summoner, however, that I knew nothing about my uncle or his past, except that my mother had mentioned him as a man of gigantic physique, but with little courage or power of will. Having heard all that Haynes had to tell me, I lowered the front legs of my chair to the floor and looked at my watch. It was late afternoon. "How far is it out to the church?" I inquired. "Think I can make it before sunset?" "Sure, lad, you ain't going out there tonight. Not to that place." The old man trembled noticeably in every limb and half rose from his chair, stretching out a lean, detaining hand. "Why, it's plumb foolishness," he exclaimed. I laughed aside his fears and informed him that, come what may, I was determined to see the old sexton that evening and get the whole matter over as soon as possible. I did not intend to accept the superstitions of ignorant country folk as truth, for I was convinced that all I had just heard was merely a chain of events which the over-imaginative people of Dahlbergen had happened to link with their ill luck. I felt no sense of fear or horror whatever. Seeing that I was determined to reach my uncle's house before nightfall, Haynes ushered me out of his office and reluctantly gave me the few required directions, pleading from time to time that I change my mind. He shook my hand when I left, as though he never expected to see me again. "Take care that old devil Foster don't get you," he warned again and again. "I wouldn't go near him after dark for love nor money. No, sirree." He re-entered his store, solemnly shaking his head, while I set out along a road leading to the outskirts of the town. I had walked barely 2 minutes before I sighted the moor of which Haynes had spoken. The road, flanked by a whitewashed fence, passed over the great swamp, which was overgrown with clumps of underbrush dipping down into the dank, slimy ooze. An odor of deadness and decay filled the air.
Big
Even in the
slimy
sunlit afternoon,
ooze.
little wisps of vapor could be seen rising from the unhealthful spot. On the opposite side of the moor, I turned sharply to the
Catching
left,
the
as I had been
vapors.
directed, branching from the main road. There were several houses in the vicinity, I noticed, houses which were scarcely more than huts, reflecting the extreme poverty of their owners. The road here passed under the drooping branches of enormous willows, which almost completely shut out the rays of the sun. The miasmal odor of the swamp was still in my nostrils, and the air was damp and chilly. I hurried my pace to get out of that dismal tunnel as soon as possible. Presently, I found myself in the light again. The sun, now hanging like a red ball upon the crest of the mountain, was beginning to dip low, and there, some distance ahead of me, bathed in its bloody iridescence, stood the lonely church. I began to sense that uncanniness which Haynes had mentioned, that feeling of dread which made old Arlbergen shun the place. The squat stone hulk of the church itself, with its blunt steeple, seemed like an idol to which the tombstones that surrounded it bowed down and worshipped, each with an arched top like the shoulders of a kneeling person, while over the whole assemblage the dingy grey parsonage hovered like a wraith. I had slowed my pace a trifle as I took in the scene. The sun was disappearing behind the mountain very rapidly now, and the damp air chilled me. Turning my coat collar up about my neck, I plodded on. Something caught my eye as I glanced up again. In the shadow of the church wall was something white, a thing which seemed to have no definite shape. Straining my eyes as I came nearer, I saw that it was a cross of new timber, surmounting a mound of freshly turned earth. The discovery sent a new chill through me. I realized that this must be my uncle's grave, but something told me that it was not like the other graves near it. It did not seem like a dead grave. In some intangible way, it appeared to be living, if a grave can be said to live. Very close to it, I saw as I came nearer, was another grave, an old mound with a crumbling stone about it. Dominie Slop's tomb, I thought, remembering Haynes's story. There was no sign of life anywhere about the place. In the semi-twilight, I climbed the low knoll upon which the parsonage stood and hammered upon the door. There was no answer. I skirted the house and peered into the windows. The whole place seemed deserted. The lowering mountains had made nightfall with disarming suddenness the minute the sun was fully hidden. I realized that I could see scarcely more than a few feet ahead of me. Feeling my way carefully, I rounded a corner of the house and paused, wondering what to do next. Everything was quiet. There was not a breath of wind, nor were there even the usual noises made by animals in their nocturnal ramblings. All dread had been forgotten for a time, but in the presence of that sepulchral calm, my apprehensions returned. I imagined the air peopled with ghastly spirits that pressed around me, making the air almost unbreathable. I wondered for the 100th time where the old sexton might be. As I stood there, half expecting some sinister demon to creep from the shadows, I noticed 2 lighted windows glaring from the belfry of the church. I then remembered what Haynes had told me about Foster's living in the basement of the building. Advancing cautiously through the blackness, I found a side door of the church ajar. The interior had a musty and mildewed odor. Everything I touched was covered with the cold, clammy moisture. I struck a match and began to explore, to discover, if I could, how to get into the belfry. Suddenly, I stopped in my tracks.
That would be so much better than
song,
that.
loud and obscene, sung in a voice
Except
that was
that's
guttural and thick with
45
drink,
and
came
that's
from above.
9 mil.
The match burned my fingers, and I dropped it. 2 pinpoints of light pierced the darkness of the farther wall of the church, and below them, to one side, I could see a door outlined where light filtered through its cracks. The song stopped as abruptly as it had commenced, and there was absolute silence again. My heart was thumping, blood racing through my temples. Had I not been petrified with fear, I should have fled immediately. Not caring to light another match, I felt my way among the pews until I stood in front of the door. So deep was the feeling of depression which had come over me that I felt as though I were acting in a dream. My actions were almost involuntary. The door was locked, as I found when I turned the knob. I hammered upon it for some time. There was no answer. The silence was as complete as before. Feeling around the edge of the door, I found the hinges, removed the pins from them, and allowed the door to fall toward me. Dim light flooded down a steep flight of steps. There was a sickening odor of whiskey. I could now hear someone stirring in the belfry room above. Venturing a low halloo, I thought I heard a groan in reply, and cautiously climbed the stairs. My first glance into that unhallowed place was indeed startling. Strewn about the little room were old and dusty books and manuscripts, strange things that bespoke an almost unbelievable age. On rows of shelves which reached to the ceiling were horrible things in glass jars and bottles, snakes and lizards and bats. Dust and mold and cobwebs encrusted everything. In the center, behind a table upon which was a lighted candle, a nearly empty bottle of whiskey and a glass, was a motionless figure with a thin, scrawny, wrinkled face and wild eyes that stared blankly through me. I recognized Abel Foster, the old sexton, in an instant. He did not move or speak as I came slowly and fearfully toward him. "Mr. Foster?" I asked, trembling with unaccountable fear when I heard my voice echo within the close confines of the room. There was no reply, and no movement from the figure behind the table. I wondered if he had not drunk himself to insensibility, and went behind the table to shake him. At the mere touch of my arm upon his shoulder, the strange old man started from his chair as though terrified. His eyes, still having in them that same blank stare, were fixed upon me. Swinging his arms like flails, he backed away. "Don't!" he screamed. "Don't touch me! Go back! Go back!" I saw that he was both drunk and struck with some kind of nameless terror. Using a soothing tone, I told him who I was and why I had come. He seemed to understand vaguely and sank back into his chair, sitting limp and motionless. "I thought you was him," he mumbled. "I thought you was him come back for it. He's been a-trying to get out since I put him in there." His voice again rose to a scream, and he clutched his chair. "Maybe he's got out now. Maybe he's out." I looked about, half expecting to see some spectral shape coming up the stairs. "Maybe who's out?" I inquired. "Vanderhoof," he shrieked. "The cross over his grave keeps falling down in the night. Every morning the earth is loose and gets harder to pat down. He'll come out and I won't be able to do nothing." Forcing him back into the chair, I seated myself on a box near him. He was trembling in mortal terror, with the saliva dripping from the corners of his mouth. From time to time, I felt that sense of horror which Haynes had described when he told me of the old sexton. Truly, there was something uncanny about the man. His head had now sunk forward upon his breast, and he seemed calmer, mumbling to himself. I quietly arose and opened a window to let out the fumes of whiskey and the musty odor of dead things. Light from a dim moon, just risen, made objects below barely visible. I could just see Dominie Vanderhoof's grave from my position in the belfry, and blinked my eyes as I gazed at it. That cross was tilted. I remembered that it had been vertical an hour ago. Fear took possession of me again. I turned quickly. Foster sat in his chair watching me. His glance was saner than before. "So you're Vanderhoof's nephew," he mumbled in a nasal tone. "Well, you might's well know it all. He'll be back out of me afore long, he will, just as soon as he can get out of that there grave. You might's well know all about it now." His terror appeared to have left him. He seemed resigned to some horrible fate which he expected any minute. His head dropped down upon his chest again, and he went on muttering in that nasal monotone. "You see all them there books and papers? Well, they was once Dominie Slot's. Dominie Slot, who was here years ago. All them things has got to do with magic. Black magic that the old Dominie knew afore he come to this country. They used to burn 'em and boil 'em in oil for knowing that over there, they did. But old Slot knew, and he didn't go for to tell nobody. No, sir, old Slot used to preach here generations ago, and he used to come up here and study them books, use all of them dead things in jars and pronounce magic curses and things. But he didn't let nobody know it. No, nobody knowed it but Dominie Slot and me." "You?" I ejaculated, leaning across the table toward him. "That is me, after I learned it." His face showed lines of trickery as he answered me. I found all this stuff here when I come to be church sexton, and I used to read it when I wanted work, and I soon got to know all about it." The old man droned on while I listened, spellbound. He told about learning the difficult formulae of demonology, so that by means of incantations he could cast spells over human beings. He had performed horrible occult rites of his hellish creed, calling down anathema upon the town and its inhabitants. Crazed by his desires, he tried to bring the church under his spell, but the power of God was too strong. Finding Johannes van der Hoof very weak-willed, he bewitched him, so that he preached strange and mystic sermons which struck fear into the simple hearts of the country folk. From his position in the belfry room, he said, behind a painting of the Temptation of Christ which adorned the rear wall of the church, he would glare at van der Hoof while he was preaching, through holes which were the eyes of the devil in the picture. Terrified by the uncanny things which were happening in their midst, the congregation left one by one, and Foster was able to do what he pleased with the church and with van der Hoof. "But what did you do with him?" I asked in a hollow voice, as the old sexton paused in his confession. He burst into a cackle of laughter, throwing back his head in drunken glee. I took his soul," he howled in a tone that set me trembling. "I took his soul and put it in a bottle, in a little black bottle, and I buried him. But he ain't got his soul, and he can't go neither to heaven nor hell. But he's a-coming back after it. He's a-trying to get out of his grave now. I can hear him pushing his way up through the ground. He's that strong." As the old man had proceeded with his story, I had become more and more convinced that he must be telling me the truth, and not merely gibbering in drunkenness. Every detail fitted what Haynes had told me. Fear was growing upon me by degrees. With the old wizard now shouting with demoniac laughter, I was tempted to bolt down the narrow stairway and leave that accursed neighborhood. To calm myself, I rose and again looked out of the window. My eyes nearly started from their sockets when I saw that the cross above van der Hoof's grave had fallen perceptibly since I had last looked at it. It was now tilted to an angle of 45 degrees. "Can't we dig up van der Hoof and restore his soul?" I asked almost breathlessly, feeling that something must be done in a hurry. The old man rose from his chair in terror. No, he screamed. "He'd kill me. I forget the formula, and if he gets out, he'll be alive, without a soul. He'd kill us both." "Where is the bottle that contains his soul?" I asked, advancing threateningly toward him. I felt that some ghastly thing was about to happen, which I must do all in my power to prevent. "I won't tell you, you young whelp," he snarled. I felt, rather than saw, a queer light in his eyes as he backed into a corner. "And don't you touch me either, or you'll wish you hadn't." I moved a step forward, noticing that on a low stool behind him there were 2 black bottles. Foster muttered some peculiar words in a low sing-song voice. Everything began to turn grey before my eyes, and something within me seemed to be dragged upward, trying to get out at my throat. I felt my knees become weak. Lurching forward, I caught the old sexton by the throat, and with my free arm reached for the bottles on the stool. But the old man fell backward, striking the stool with his foot, and one bottle fell to the floor as I snatched the other. There was a flash of blue flame, and a sulphurous smell filled the room. From the little heap of broken glass, a white vapor rose and followed the draught out the window. "Curse you, you rascal!" sounded a voice that seemed faint and far away. Foster, whom I had released when the bottle broke, looking smaller and shriveled than before. His face was slowly turning greenish black. "Curse you!" said the voice again, hardly sounding as though it came from his lips. "I'm done for. That one in there was mine. Dominus Slot took it out 200 years ago." He slid slowly toward the floor, gazing at me with hatred in eyes that were rapidly dimming. His flesh
lost its soul,
right to black,
he did.
and then to yellow. I saw with horror that that his body seemed to be crumbling away and his clothing falling into limp folds. The bottle in my hand was growing warm. I glanced at it fearfully. It glowed with a faint phosphorescence. Stiff with fright, I set it upon the table, but could not keep my eyes from it. There was an ominous moment of silence as its glow became brighter, and then there came distinctly to my ears the sound of sliding earth. Gasping for breath, I looked out of the window. The moon was now well up in the sky, and by its light I could see that the fresh cross above Vanderhoof's grave had completely fallen. Once again there came the sound of trickling gravel, and no longer able to control myself, I stumbled down the stairs and found my way out of doors. Falling now and then as I raced over the uneven ground, I ran on in abject terror. When I had reached the foot of the knoll at the entrance to that gloomy tunnel beneath the willows, I heard a horrible roar behind me. Turning, I glanced back toward the church. Its wall reflected the light of the moon, and silhouetted against it was a gigantic, loathsome black shadow climbing from my uncle's grave and floundering gruesomely toward the church. I told my story to a group of villagers in Haynes's store the next morning. They looked from one to the other with little smiles during my tale, I noticed, but when I suggested that they accompany me to the spot, gave various excuses for not caring to go. Though there seemed to be a limit to their credulity, they cared to run no risks. I informed them that I would go alone, though I must confess that the project did not appeal to me. As I left the store, one old man with a long white beard hurried after me and caught my arm. "I'll go with you, lad," he said. "It do seem that I once heard my grandpap tell us something of the sort concerning old Dominie Slot. A queer old man, I've heard he were, but Vanderhoof's been worse." Dominie Vanderhoof's grave was open and deserted when we arrived. Of course, it could have been grave robbers, the two of us agreed, and yet... In the belfry, the bottle which I had left upon the table was gone, though the fragments of the broken one were found on the floor, and upon the heap of yellow dust and crumpled clothing that had once been Abel Foster were certain immense footprints. After glancing at some of the books and papers strewn about the belfry room, we carried them down the stairs and burned them as something unclean and unholy. With a spade, which we found in the church basement, we filled in the grave of Johannes Vanderhoof, and, as an afterthought, flung the fallen cross upon the flames. Old wives say that now, when the moon is full, there walks about the churchyard a gigantic and bewildered figure, clutching a bottle and seeking some unremembered goal. Thank you for listening today. If you'd like to... Welcome once again to Horror Babble, of fever in all its diverse forms. Back of the appointment stretched an extended and not wholly unromantic history of early friendship, long separation, and dramatically renewed acquaintance. James Dalton and the Clarendon family had been friends in New York 10 years before, friends and more than friends, since the doctor's only sister, Georgina, was the sweetheart of Dalton's youth, while the doctor himself had been his closest associate and almost his protege in the days of school and college. The father of Alfred and Georgina, a Wall Street pirate of the ruthless elder breed, had known Dalton's father well, so well indeed, that he had finally stripped him of all he possessed in a memorable afternoon's fight on the stock exchange. Dalton Sr., hopeless of recuperation and wishing to give his one adored child the benefit of his insurance, had promptly blown out his brains, but James had not sought to retaliate. It was, as he viewed it, all in the game, and he wished no harm to the father of the girl he meant to marry, and of the budding young scientist whose admirer and protector he had been throughout their years of fellowship and study. Instead, he turned to the law, established himself in a small way, and in due course of time asked old Clarendon for Georgina's hand. Old Clarendon had refused very firmly and loudly, vowing that no pauper and upstart lawyer was fit to be his son-in-law. and a scene of considerable violence had occurred. James, telling the wrinkled freebooter at last what he ought to have been told long before, had left the house in the city in a high temper, and was embarked within a month upon the California life which was to lead him to the governorship through many a fight with ring and politician. His farewells to Alfred and Georgina had been brief, and he had never known the aftermath of that scene in the Clarendon library. Only by a day did he miss the news of old Clarendon's death from apoplexy, and by so missing it, changed the course of his whole career. He had not written Georgina in the decade that followed, knowing her loyalty to her father, and waiting till his own fortune and position might remove all obstacles to the match. Nor had he sent any word to Alfred, whose calm indifference in the face of affection and hero worship had always savoured of conscious destiny and the self-sufficiency of genius. Secure in the ties of a constancy rare even then, he had worked and risen with thoughts only of the future, still a bachelor, and with a perfect intuitive faith that Georgina also was waiting. In this faith Dalton was not deceived. Wondering perhaps why no message ever came, Georgina found no romance save in her dreams and expectations, and in the course of time became busy with the new responsibilities brought by her brother's rise to greatness. Alfred's growth had not belied the promise of his youth, and the slim boy had darted quietly up the steps of science with a speed and permanence almost dizzying to contemplate. Lean and ascetic, with steel-rimmed pince-nez and pointed brown beard, Dr. Alfred Clarendon was an authority at 25 and an international figure at 30. Careless of worldly affairs with the negligence of genius, he depended vastly on the care and management of his sister, and was secretly thankful that her memories of James had kept her from other and more tangible alliances. Georgina conducted the business and household of the great bacteriologist, and was proud of his strides toward the conquest of fever. She bore patiently with his eccentricities, calmed his occasional bursts of fanaticism, and healed those breaches with his friends which now and then resulted from his unconcealed scorn of anything less than a single-minded devotion to pure truth and its progress. Clarendon was undeniably irritating at times to ordinary folk, for he never tired of depreciating the service of the individual as contrasted with the service of mankind as a whole, and in censuring men of learning who mingled domestic life or outside interests with their pursuit of abstract science. His enemies called him a bore, but his admirers, pausing before the white heat of ecstasy into which he would work himself, became almost ashamed of ever having any standards or aspirations outside the one divine sphere of unalloyed knowledge. The doctor's travels were extensive, and Georgina generally accompanied him on the shorter ones. 3 times, however, he had taken long, lone jaunts to strange and distant places in his studies of exotic fevers and half-fabulous plagues, for he knew that it is out of the unknown lands of cryptic and immemorial Asia that most of the earth's diseases spring. On each of these occasions, he had brought back curious mementos which added to the eccentricity of his home, not least among which was the needlessly large staff of Tibetan servants picked up somewhere in Yutsang during an epidemic of which the world never heard, but amidst which Clarendon had discovered and isolated the germ of black fever. These men, taller than most Tibetans and clearly belonging to a stock but little investigated in the outside world, were of a skeletonic leanness which made one wonder whether the doctor had sought to symbolize in them the anatomical models of his college years. Their aspect, in the loose black silk robes of bon paprice which he chose to give them, was grotesque in the highest degree, and there was an unsmiling silence and stiffness in their motions which enhanced their air of fantasy, and gave Georgina a queer, awed feeling of having stumbled into the pages of Vathek or the Arabian Nights. But queerest of all was the general factotum or clinic man whom Clarendon addressed as Surama, and whom he had brought back with him after a long stay in northern Africa, during which he had studied certain odd intermittent fevers among the mysterious Saharan Tuaregs, whose descent from the primal race of lost Atlantis is an old archaeological rumor. Surama, a man of great intelligence and seemingly inexhaustible erudition, was as morbidly lean as the Tibetan servants, with swarthy, parchment-like skin, drawn so tightly over his bold pate and hairless face that every line of the skull stood out in ghastly prominence. this death's head effect being heightened by lusterlessly burning black eyes set with a depth which left to common visibility only a pair of dark, vacant sockets. Unlike the ideal subordinate, he seemed, despite his impassive features, to spend no effort in concealing such emotions as he possessed. Instead, he carried about an insidious atmosphere of irony or amusement, accompanied at certain moments by a deep, guttural chuckle like that of a giant turtle which has just torn to pieces some furry animal and is ambling away toward the sea. His race appeared to be Caucasian, but could not be classified more closely than that. Some of Clarendon's friends thought he looked like a high-caste Hindu, notwithstanding his accentless speech, but many agreed with Georgina, who disliked him, when she gave her opinion that a pharaoh's mummy, if miraculously brought to life, would form a very apt twin for this sardonic skeleton. Dalton, absorbed in his uphill political battles and isolated from Eastern interests with the peculiar self-sufficiency of the Old West, had not followed the meteoric rise of his former comrade. Clarendon had actually heard nothing of one so far outside his chosen world of science as the governor. Being of independent and even of abundant means, the Clarendons had for many years stuck to their old Manhattan mansion in East 19th Street, whose ghosts must have looked sorely askance at the bizarrerie of Surama and the Tibetans. Then, through the doctor's wish to transfer his base of medical observation, the great change had suddenly come, and they had crossed the continent to take up a secluded life in San Francisco, buying the gloomy old Bannister place near Goat Hill, overlooking the bay, and establishing their strange household in a rambling, French-roofed relic of mid-Victorian design and gold-rush parvenu display, set amidst high-walled grounds in a region still half suburban. Dr. Clarendon, though better satisfied than in New York, still felt cramped for lack of opportunities to apply and test his pathological theories. Unworldly as he was, he had never thought of using his reputation as an influence to gain public appointment, though more and more he realized that only the medical directorship of a government or a charitable institution, prison, almshouse, or hospital would give him a field of sufficient width to complete his researches and make his discoveries of the greatest use to humanity and science at large. Then he had run into James Dalton by sheer accident one afternoon in Market Street, as the governor was swinging out of the Royal Hotel. Georgina had been with him, and an almost instant recognition had heightened the drama of the reunion. Mutual ignorance of one another's progress had bred long explanation and histories, and Clarendon was pleased to find that he had so important an official for a friend. Dalton and Georgina, exchanging many a glance, felt more than a trace of their youthful tenderness, and a friendship was then and there revived, which led to frequent calls and a fuller and fuller exchange of confidences. James Dalton learned of his old protégé's need for political appointment, and sought, true to his protective role of school and college days, to devise some means of giving little Alf the needed position and scope. He had, it is true, wide appointive powers, but the legislature's constant attacks and encroachments forced him to exercise these with the utmost discretion. At length, however, scarcely 3 months after the sudden reunion, the foremost institutional medical office in the state fell vacant. Weighing all the elements with care, and conscious that his friend's achievements and reputation would justify the most substantial rewards, the governor felt at last able to act. Formalities were few, and on the 8th of November, 1893, Dr. Alfred Schuyler Clarendon became medical director of the California State Penitentiary at San Quentin. 2. In scarcely more than a month, the hopes of Dr. Clarendon's admirers were amply fulfilled. Sweeping changes in methods brought to the prison's medical routine an efficiency never before dreamed of. And though the subordinates were naturally not without jealousy, they were obliged to admit the magical results of a really great man's superintendence. Then came a time when mere appreciation might well have grown to devout thankfulness at a providential conjunction of time, place, and man. For one morning, Dr. Jones came to his new chief with a grave face to announce his discovery of a case which he could not but identify as that self-same black fever whose germ Clarendon had found and classified. Dr. Clarendon showed no surprise, but kept on at the writing before him. "I know," he said evenly. "I came across that case yesterday. I'm glad you recognized it. Put the man in a separate ward, though I don't believe this fever is contagious." Dr. Jones, with his own opinion of the maladie's
Dr.
contagious,
Jones?
was glad of this deference to caution.
No
and
tap for
hastened to
love,
execute
Dr.
the order.
Jones.
Upon his return, Clarendon rose to leave, declaring that he would himself take charge of the case alone. Disappointed in his wish to study the great man's methods and technique, the junior physician watched his chief stride away toward the lone ward where he had placed the patient, more critical of the new regime than at any time since admiration had displaced his first jealous pangs. Reaching the ward, Clarendon entered hastily, glancing at the bed and stepping back to see how far Dr. Jones's obvious curiosity might have led him. Then, finding the corridor still vacant, he shut the door and turned to examine the sufferer. The man was a convict of a peculiarly repulsive type, and seemed to be racked by the keenest throes of agony. His features were frightfully contracted, and his knees drawn sharply up in the mute desperation of the stricken. Clarendon studied him closely, raising his tightly shut eyelids, took his pulse and temperature, and finally, dissolving a tablet in water, forced the solution between the sufferer's lips. Before long, the height of the attack abated, as shown by the relaxing body and returning normality of expression, and the patient began to breathe more easily. Then, by a soft rubbing of the ears, the doctor caused the man to open his eyes. There was life in them, for they moved from side to side, though they lacked the fine fire which we are wont to deem the image of the soul. Clarendon smiled as he surveyed the piece his help had brought, feeling behind him the power of an all-capable science. He had long known of this case, and had snatched the victim from death with the work of a moment. Another hour, and this man would have gone. Yet Jones had seen the symptoms for days before discovering them, and having discovered them, did not know what to do. Man's conquest of disease, however, cannot be perfect. Clarendon, assuring the dubious trusty nurses that the fever was not contagious, had had the patient bathed, sponged in alcohol, and put to bed, but was told the next morning that the case was lost. The man had died after midnight in the most intense agony, and with such cries and distortions of face that the nurses were driven almost to panic. The doctor took this news with his usual calm, whatever his scientific feelings may have been, and ordered the burial of the patient in quicklime. Then, with a philosophic shrug of the shoulders, he made the usual rounds of the penitentiary. 2 days later, the prison was hit again. 3 men came down at once this time, and there was no concealing the fact that a black fever epidemic was underway. Clarendon, having adhered so firmly to his theory of non-contagiousness, suffered a distinct loss of prestige, and was handicapped by the refusal of the trusty nurses to attend the patients. Theirs was not the soul-free devotion of those who sacrificed themselves to science and humanity. They were
Low
convicts,
insulation
serving
for
only because of
hunting
the privileges they
jackets?
could not otherwise buy, and when the price became too great, they preferred to resign the privileges. But the doctor was still master of the situation, consulting with the warden and sending urgent messages to his friend the governor. He saw to it that special rewards in cash and in reduced terms were offered to the convicts for the dangerous nursing service, and by this method succeeded in getting a very fair quota of volunteers. He was steeled for action now, and nothing could shake his poise and determination. Additional cases brought only a curt nod, and he seemed a stranger to fatigue as he hastened from bedside to bedside all over the vast stone home of sadness and evil. More than 40 cases developed within another week, and nurses had to be brought from the city. Clarendon went home very seldom at this stage, often sleeping on a cot in the warden's quarters, and always giving himself up with typical abandon to the service of medicine and of mankind. Then came the first mutterings of that storm which was soon to convulse San Francisco. News will out, and the menace of black fever spread over the town like a fog from the bay. Reporters trained in the doctrine of sensation first used their imagination without restraint, and gloried when at last they were able to produce a case in the Mexican quarter, which a local physician, fonder perhaps of money than of truth or civic welfare, pronounced black fever. That was the last straw. frantic at the thought of the crawling death so close upon them, the people of San Francisco went mad en masse and embarked upon that historic exodus of which all the country was soon to hear over busy wires. Ferries and rowboats, excursion steamers and launches, railways and cable cars, bicycles and carriages, moving vans and work carts, all were pressed into instant and frenzied service. Sausalito and Tamalpais, as lying in the direction of San Quentin, shared in the flight, while housing space in Oakland, Berkeley, and Alameda rose to fabulous prices. Tent colonies sprang up, and improvised villages lined the crowded southward highways from Millbrae to San Jose. Many sought refuge with friends in Sacramento, while the fright-shaken residue forced by various causes to stay behind could do little more than maintain the basic necessities of a nearly dead city. Business, save for quack doctors with sure cures and preventives for use against the fever, fell rapidly to the vanishing point. At first, the saloons offered medicated drinks, but soon found that the populace preferred to be duped by charlatans of more professional aspect. In strangely noiseless streets, persons peered into one another's faces to glimpse possible plague symptoms, and shopkeepers began more and more to refuse admission to their clientele, each customer seeming to them a fresh fever menace. Legal and judicial machinery began to disintegrate as attorneys and county clerks succumbed one by one to the urge for flight. Even the doctors deserted in large numbers, many of them pleading the need of vacations among the mountains and the lakes in the northern part of the state. Schools and colleges, theaters and cafes, restaurants and saloons all gradually closed their doors, and in a single week, San Francisco lay prostrate and inert, with only its light, power, and water service even half normal, with newspapers in skeletonic form, and with a crippled parody on transportation maintained by the horse and cable cars. This was the lowest ebb. It could not last long. Courage and observation are not altogether dead in mankind, and sooner or later the non-existence of any widespread black fever epidemic outside San Quentin became too obvious a fact to deny, notwithstanding several actual cases and the undeniable spread of typhoid in the unsanitary suburban tent colonies. The leaders and editors of the community conferred and took action.
That's how you get
enlisting
an
in the service the very reporters
epidemic.
whose energies had done so much to bring on the trouble, but now turning their sensation-first avidity into more constructive channels. Editorials and fictitious interviews appeared, telling of Dr. Clarendon's complete control of the disease and of the absolute impossibility of its diffusion beyond the prison walls. Reiteration and circulation slowly did their work, and gradually a slim backward trickle of urbanites swelled into a vigorous, refluent stream. One of the first healthy symptoms was the start of a newspaper controversy of the approved acrimonious kind, attempting to fix blame for the panic wherever the various participants thought it belonged. The returning doctors, jealously strengthened by their timely vacations, began striking at Clarendon, assuring the public that they as well as he would keep the fever in leash, and censuring him for not doing even more to check its spread within San Quentin. Clarendon had, they averred, permitted far more deaths than were necessary. The veriest tyro in medicine knew how to check fever contagion, and if this renowned savant did not do it, it was clearly because he chose for scientific reasons to study the final effects of the disease, rather than to prescribe properly and save the victims. This policy, they insinuated, might be proper enough among convicted murderers in a penal institution, but it would not do in San Francisco, where life was still a precious and sacred thing. Thus they went on, and the papers were glad to publish all they wrote, since the sharpness of the campaign, in which Dr. Clarendon would doubtless join, would help to obliterate confusion and restore confidence among the people. But Clarendon did not reply. He only smiled, while his singular clinic Mansurama indulged in many a deep, testudinous chuckle. He was at home more nowadays, so that reporters began besieging the gate of the great wall the doctor had built around his house, instead of pestering the warden's office at San Quentin. Results, though, were equally meager. The Sarama formed an impassable barrier between the doctor and the outer world, even after the reporters had got into the grounds. The newspaper men getting access to the front hall had glimpses of Clarendon's singular entourage, and made the best they could in a write-up of Sarama and the queer skeletonic Tibetans. Exaggeration, of course, occurred in every fresh article, and the net effect of the publicity was distinctly adverse to the great physician. Most persons hate the unusual, and hundreds who could have excused heartlessness or incompetence stood ready to condemn the grotesque taste manifested in the chuckling attendant and the 8 black-robed Orientals. Early in January, an especially persistent young man from the Observer climbed the moated 8-foot brick wall in the rear of the Clarendon grounds and began a survey of the varied outdoor appearances which trees concealed from the front walk. With quick, alert brain, he took in everything: the rose arbor, the aviaries, the animal cages where all sorts of mammalia from monkeys to guinea pigs might be seen and heard, the stout wooden clinic building with barred windows in the northwest corner of the yard, and bent, searching glances throughout the 1,000 square feet of intramural privacy. A great article was brewing, and he would have escaped unscathed but for the barking of Dick, Georgina Clarendon's gigantic and beloved St. Bernard. Sarama, instant in his response, had the youth by the collar before a protest could be uttered, and was presently shaking him as a terrier shakes a rat, and dragging him through the trees to the front yard and the gate. Breathless explanations and quavering demands to see Dr. Clarendon were useless. Sarama only chuckled and dragged his victim on. Suddenly, a positive fright crept over the dapper scribe, and he began to wish desperately that this unearthly creature would speak, if only to prove that he really was a being of honest flesh and blood belonging to this planet. He became deathly sick, and strove not to glimpse the eyes which he knew must lie at the base of those gaping black sockets. Soon he heard the gate open, and felt himself propelled violently through, in another moment waking rudely to the things of earth, as he landed wetly and muddily in the ditch which Clarendon had dug around the entire length of the wall. Fright gave a place to rage as he heard the massive gate slam shut, and he rose dripping to shake his fist at the forbidding portal. Then, as he turned to go, a soft sound grated behind him, and through a small wicket in the gate he felt the sunken eyes of Sarama, and heard the echoes of a deep-voiced, blood-freezing chuckle. This young man, feeling perhaps justly that his handling had been rougher than he deserved, resolved to revenge himself upon the household responsible for his treatment. Accordingly, he prepared a fictitious interview with Dr. Clarendon, supposed to be held in the clinic building, during which he was careful to describe the agonies of a dozen black fever patients, whom his imagination ranged on orderly rows of couches. His master stroke was the picture of one especially pathetic sufferer gasping for water, while the doctor held a glass of the sparkling fluid just out of his reach, in a scientific attempt to determine the effect of a tantalizing emotion on the course of the disease. This invention was followed by paragraphs of insinuating comments so outwardly respectful that it bore a double venom. Dr. Clarendon was, the article ran, undoubtedly the greatest and most single-minded scientist in the world. But science is no friend to individual welfare, and one would not like to have one's gravest ills drawn out and aggravated merely to satisfy an investigator on some point of abstract truth. Life is too short for that. Altogether, the article was diabolically skillful, and succeeded in horrifying 9 readers out of 10 against Dr. Clarendon and his supposed methods. Other papers were quick to copy and enlarge upon its substance, taking the cue it offered and commencing a series of faked interviews which fairly ran the gamut of derogatory fantasy. In no case, however, did the doctor condescend to offer a contradiction. He had no time to waste on fools and liars, and cared little for the esteem of a thoughtless rabble he despised. When James Dalton telegraphed his regrets and offered aid, Clarendon replied with an almost boorish curtness. He did not heed the barking of dogs, and could not bother to muzzle them, nor would he thank anyone for messing with a matter wholly beneath notice. Silent and contemptuous, he continued his duties with tranquil evenness. But the young reporter's spark had done its work. San Francisco was insane again, and this time as much with rage as with fear. Sober judgment became a lost art, and though no second exodus occurred, there ensued a reign of vice and recklessness, born of desperation and suggesting parallel phenomena in medieval times of pestilence. Hatred ran riot against the man who had found the disease and was struggling to restrain it, and a light-headed public forgot his great services to knowledge in their efforts to fan the flames of resentment. They seemed, in their blindness, to hate him in person, rather than the plague which had come to their breeze-cleaned and usually healthy city. Then the young reporter, playing in the neuronic fire he had kindled, added a crowning personal touch of his own. Remembering the indignities he had suffered at the hands of the cadaverous clinic man, he prepared a masterly article on the home and environment of Dr. Clarendon, giving a special prominence to Sarama, whose very aspect he declared sufficient to scare the healthiest person into any sort of fever. He tried to make the gaunt chuckler appear equally ridiculous and terrible, succeeding best, perhaps, in the latter half of his intention, since a tide of horror always welled up whenever he thought of his brief proximity to the creature. He collected all the rumors current about the man, elaborated on the unholy depth of his reputed scholarship, and hinted darkly that it could have been no godly realm of secret and eon-weighted Africa wherein Dr. Clarendon had found him. Georgina, who followed the papers closely, felt crushed and hurt by these attacks upon her brother, but James Dalton, who called often at the house, did his best to comfort her. In this he was warm and sincere, for he wished not only to console the woman he loved, but to utter some measure of the reverence he had always felt for the starward-bound genius who had been his youth's closest comrade. He told Georgina how greatness can never be exempted from the shafts of envy, and cited the long, sad list of splendid brains crushed beneath vulgar heels. The attacks, he pointed out, formed the truest of all proofs of Alfred's solid eminence. But they hurt just the same, she rejoined, and all the more because I know that Al really suffers from them, no matter how indifferent he tries to be. Dalton kissed her hand in a manner not then obsolete among well-born persons. And it hurts me 1,000 times more knowing that it hurts you and Alf. But never mind, Georgie, we'll stand together and pull through it. Thus it came about that Georgina came more and more to rely on the strength of the steel-firm, square-jawed governor who had been her youthful swain, and more to confide in him the things she feared. The press attacks and the epidemic were not quite all. There were aspects of the household which she did not like. Sarama, cruel in equal measure to man and beast, filled her with the most unnameable repulsion, and she could not but feel that he meant some vague, indefinable harm to Alfred. She did not like the Tibetans either, and thought it very peculiar that Sarama was able to talk with them. Alfred would not tell her who or what Sarama was, but had once explained rather haltingly that he was a much older man than would be commonly thought credible, and that he had mastered secrets and been through experiences calculated to make him a colleague of phenomenal value for any scientist seeking nature's hidden mysteries. Urged by her uneasiness, Dalton became a still more frequent visitor at the Clarendon home, though he saw that his presence was deeply resented by Sarama. The bony clinic man formed the habit of glaring peculiarly from those spectral sockets when admitting him, and would often, after closing the gate when he left, chuckle monotonously in a manner that made his flesh creep. Meanwhile, Dr. Clarendon seemed oblivious of everything save his work at San Quentin, whither he went each day in his launch, alone save for Sarama, who managed the wheel while the doctor read or collated his notes. Dalton welcomed these regular absences, for they gave him constant opportunities to renew his suit for Georgina's hand. When he would overstay and meet Alfred, however, the latter's greeting was always friendly, despite his habitual reserve. In time, the engagement of James and Georgina grew to be a definite thing, and the two awaited only a favorable chance to speak to Alfred. The governor, whole-souled in everything and firm in his protective loyalty, spared no pains in spreading propaganda on his old friend's behalf. Press and officialdom both felt his influence, and he even succeeded in interesting scientists in the East, many of whom came to California to study the plague and investigate the anti-fever bacillus which Clarendon was so rapidly isolating and perfecting. These doctors and biologists, however, did not obtain the information they wished, so that several of them left with a very unfortunate impression. Not a few prepared articles hostile to Clarendon, accusing him of an unscientific and fame-seeking attitude, and intimating that he concealed his methods through a highly unprofessional desire for ultimate personal profit. Others, fortunately, were more liberal in their judgments, and wrote enthusiastically of Clarendon and his work. They had seen the patients and could appreciate how marvelously he held the dread disease in leash. His secrecy regarding the antitoxin they deemed quite justifiable, since its public diffusion in unperfected form could not but do more harm than good. Clarendon himself, whom many of their number had met before, impressed them more profoundly than ever, and they did not hesitate to compare him with Jenner, Lister, Koch, Pasteur, Metchnikoff, and the rest of those whose whole lives have served pathology and humanity. Dalton was careful to save for Alfred all the magazines that spoke well of him, bringing them in person as an excuse to see Georgina. They did not, however, produce much effect save a contemptuous smile, and Clarendon would generally throw them to Sir Rama, whose deep, disturbing chuckle upon reading formed a close parallel to the doctor's own ironic amusement. One Monday evening, early in February, Dalton called with the definite intention of asking Clarendon for his sister's hand. Georgina herself admitted him to the grounds, and as they walked toward the house, he stopped to pat the great dog which rushed up and laid friendly forepaws on his breast. It was Dick, Georgina's cherished St. Bernard, and Dalton was glad to feel that he had the affection of a creature which meant so much to her. Dick was excited and glad, and turned the governor nearly half about with his vigorous pressure as he gave a soft, quick bark and sprang off through the trees toward the clinic. He did not vanish, though, but presently stopped and looked back, softly barking again as if he wished Dalton to follow. Georgina, fond of obeying her huge pet's playful whims, motioned to James to see what he wanted, and they both walked slowly after him as he trotted relievedly to the rear of the yard, where the top of the clinic building stood silhouetted against the stars above the great brick wall. The outline of lights within showed around the edges of the dark window curtains, so they knew that Alfred and Sir Rama were at work. Suddenly, from the interior came a thin, subdued sound like a cry of a child, a plaintive call of "Mama, Mama," at which Dick barked while James and Georgina started perceptibly. Then Georgina smiled, remembering the parrots that Clarendon always kept for experimental uses, and patted Dick on the head, either to forgive him for having fooled her and Dalton, or to console him for having been fooled himself. As they turned slowly toward the house, Dalton mentioned his resolve to speak to Alfred that evening about their engagement, and Georgina supplied no objection. She knew that her brother would not relish the loss of a faithful manager and companion, but believed his affection would place no barrier in the way of her happiness. Later that evening, Clarendon came into the house with a springy step and aspect less grim than usual. Dalton, seeing a good omen in this easy buoyancy, took heart as the doctor wrung his hand with a jovial, "Ah, Jimmy, how's politics this year?" He glanced at Georgina, and she quietly excused herself, while the two men settled down to a chat on general subjects. Little by little, amidst many reminders of their old youthful days, Dalton worked toward his point, till at last he came out plainly with a crucial query. "Alf, I want to marry Georgina. Have we your blessing?" Keenly watching his old friend, Dalton saw a shadow steal over his face. The dark eyes flashed for a moment, then veiled themselves as wonted placidity returned. So science or selfishness was at work after all. "You're asking an impossibility, James. Georgina isn't the aimless butterfly she was years ago. She has a place in the service of truth and mankind now, and that place is here. She's decided to devote her life to my work, to the household that makes my work possible, and there's no room for desertion or personal caprice." Dalton waited to see if he had finished. The same old fanaticism, humanity versus the individual, and the doctor was going to let it spoil his sister's life. Then he tried to answer. "But look here, Alf. You mean to say that Georgina in particular is so necessary to your work that you must make a slave and martyr of her? Use your sense of proportion, man. If it were a question of Sir Rama or somebody in the utter thick of your experiments, it might be different. But after all, Georgina is only a housekeeper to you in the last analysis. She has promised to be my wife and says that she loves me. Have you the right to cut her off from the life that belongs to her? Have you the right? That'll do, James. Clarendon's face was set and white. Whether or not I have the right to govern my own family is no business of an outsider. Outsider? You can say that to a man who... Dalton almost choked as the steely voice of the doctor interrupted him again. An outsider to my family, and from now on an outsider to my home. Dalton, your presumption goes just a little too far. Good evening, Governor. And Clarendon strode from the room without extending his hand. Dalton hesitated for a moment, almost at a loss what to do, when presently Georgina entered. Her face showed that she had spoken with her brother, and Dalton took both her hands impetuously. Well, Georgie, what do you say? I'm afraid it's a choice between Alf and me. You know how I feel. You know how I felt before, when it was your father I was up against. What's your answer this time? He paused as she responded slowly. James, dear, do you believe that I love you? He nodded and pressed her hands expectantly. Then, if you love me, you'll wait a while. Don't think of Al's rudeness. He's to be pitied. I can't tell you the whole thing now, but you know how worried I am. What with the strain of his work, the criticisms, and the staring and cackling of that horrible creature Sarama, I'm afraid he'll break down. He shows the strain more than anyone outside the family could tell. I can see it, for I've watched him all my life. He's changing, slowly bending under his burdens, and he puts on his extra brusqueness to hide it. You can see what I mean, can't you, dear? She paused, and Dalton nodded again, pressing one of her hands to his breast. Then she concluded. So promise me, dear, to be patient. I must stand by him. I must. Dalton did not speak for a while, but his head inclined in what was almost a bow of reverence. There was more of Christ in this devoted woman than he had thought any human being possessed, and in the face of such love and loyalty he could do no urging. Words of sadness and parting were brief, and James, whose blue eyes were misty, scarcely saw the gaunt clinic man as the gate to the street was at last opened to him. But when it slammed to behind him, he heard that blood-curdling chuckle he had come to recognize so well, and knew that Sarama was there. Sarama, whom Georgina had called her brother's evil genius. Walking away with a firm step, Dalton resolved to be watchful and to act at the first sign of trouble. Three. Meanwhile, San Francisco, the epidemic still on the lips of all, seethed with anti-Clarendon feeling. Actually, the cases outside the penitentiary were very few, and confined almost wholly to the lower Mexican element, whose lack of sanitation was a standing invitation to disease of every kind. But politicians and the people needed no more than this to confirm the attacks made by the doctor's enemies. Seeing that Dalton was immovable in his championship of Clarendon, the malcontents, medical dogmatists, and ward healers turned their attention to the state legislature, lining up the anti-Clarendonists and the governor's old enemies with great shrewdness, and preparing to launch a law with a veto-proof majority, transferring the authority for minor institutional appointments from the chief executive to the various boards or commissions concerned. In the furtherance of this measure, no lobbyist was more active than Clarendon's chief assistant, Dr. Jones. Jealous of his superior from the first, he now saw an opportunity for turning matters to his liking, and he thanked fate for the circumstance, responsible indeed for his present position, of his relationship to the chairman of the prison board. The new law, if passed, would certainly mean the removal of Clarendon and the appointment of himself in his stead. So, mindful of his own interest, he worked hard for it. Jones was all that Clarendon was not, a natural politician and sycophantic opportunist who served his own advancement first and science only incidentally. He was poor and avid for salaried position, quite in contrast to the wealthy and independent savant he sought to displace. So, with a rat-like cunning and persistence, he labored to undermine the great biologist above him, and was one day rewarded by the news that the new law was passed. Thenceforward, the governor was powerless to make appointments to the state institutions, and the medical directorship of San Quentin lay at the disposal of the prison board. Of all this legislative turmoil, Clarendon was singularly oblivious. Wrapped wholly in matters of administration and research, he was blind to the treason of that ass Jones, who worked by his side, and deaf to all the gossip of the warden's office. He had never in his life read the newspapers, and the banishment of Dalton from his house cut off his last real link with the world of outside events. With the naivety of a recluse, he at no time thought of his position as insecure. In view of Dalton's loyalty, and of his forgiveness of even the greatest wrongs, as shown in his dealings with the elder Clarendon, who had crushed his father to death on the stock exchange, the possibility of a gubernatorial dismissal was, of course, out of the question. Nor could the doctor's political ignorance envisage a sudden shift of power, which might place the matter of retention or dismissal in very different hands. Thereupon he merely smiled with satisfaction when Dalton left for Sacramento, convinced that his place in San Quentin and his sister's place in his household were alike secure from disturbance. He was accustomed to having what he wanted, and fancied his luck was still holding out. The first week in March, a day or so after the enactment of the new law, the chairman of the prison board called at San Quentin. Clarendon was out, but Dr. Jones was glad to show the august visitor, his own uncle incidentally, to the great infirmary, including the fever ward made so famous by press and panic. By this time, converted against his will to Clarendon's belief in the fever's non-contagiousness, Jones smilingly assured his uncle that nothing was to be feared, and encouraged him to inspect the patients in detail, especially a ghastly skeleton, once a very giant of bulk and vigor, who was, he insinuated, slowly and painfully dying because Clarendon would not administer the proper medicine. "Do you mean to say," cried the chairman, "that Dr. Clarendon refuses to let the man have what he needs, knowing his life could be saved?" "Just that," snapped Dr. Jones, pausing as the door opened, to admit none other than Clarendon himself. Clarendon nodded coldly to Jones, and surveyed the visitor, whom he did not know, with disapproval. "Dr. Jones, I thought you knew this case was not to be disturbed at all. And haven't I said that visitors aren't to be admitted except by special permission?" But the chairman interrupted before his nephew could introduce him. "Pardon me, Dr. Clarendon, but am I to understand that you refuse to give this man the medicine that would save him?" Clarendon glared coldly, and rejoined with steel in his voice, "That's an impertinent question, sir. I am in authority here, and visitors are not allowed. Please leave the room at once." The chairman, his sense of drama secretly tickled, answered with greater pomp and hauteur than were necessary. "You mistake me, sir. I, not you, am master here. You're addressing the chairman of the prison board. I must say, moreover, that I deem your activity a menace to the welfare of the prisoners, and must request your resignation. Henceforth, Dr. Jones will be in charge, and if you wish to remain until your formal dismissal, you will take your orders from him." It was Wilfred Jones's great moment. Life never gave him another such climax, and we need not grudge him this one. After all, he was a small rather than a bad man, and he had only obeyed a small man's code of looking to himself at all costs. Clarendon stood still, gazing at the speaker as if he thought him mad. Till in another second the look of triumph on Dr. Jones's face convinced him that something important was indeed afoot. He was icily courteous as he replied, "No doubt you're what you claim to be, sir, but fortunately my appointment came from the governor of the state, and can therefore be revoked only by him." The chairman and his nephew both stared perplexedly, for they had not realized to what lengths unworldly ignorance can go. Then the older man, grasping the situation, explained at some length. "Had I found that the current reports did you an injustice," he concluded, "I would have deferred action. But the case of this poor man and your own arrogant manner left me no choice. As it is—" But Dr. Clarendon interrupted with a new razor sharpness in his voice. "As it is, I am the director in charge at present, and I ask you to leave this room at once." The chairman reddened and exploded. "Look here, sir. Who do you think you're talking to? I'll have you chucked out of here. Damn your impertinence." But he had time only to finish the sentence. Transformed by the insult to a sudden dynamo of hate, the slender scientist launched out with both fists in a burst of preternatural strength of which no one would have thought him capable. and if his strength was preternatural, his accuracy of aim was no less so, for not even a champion of the ring could have wrought a neater result. Both men, the chairman and Dr. Jones, were squarely hit, the one full in the face and the other on the point of the chin. Going down like felled trees, they
No
lay motionless and
magazines.
unconscious on
That's
the floor.
kind of weird.
Clarendon, now clear and completely master of himself, took his hat and cane and went out to join Sir Rama in the launch. Only when seated in the moving boat did he at last give audible vent to the frightful rage that consumed him. Then, with face convulsed, he called down imprecations from the stars and the gulfs beyond the stars, so that even Sir Rama shuddered, made an elder sign that no book of history records, and forgot to chuckle. 4.
Guy's gone mad with power.
Georgina soothed her brother's hurt as best she could. He had come home mentally and physically exhausted and thrown himself on the library lounge, and in that gloomy room, little by little, the faithful sister had taken
And
in
he
the almost
pouted.
incredible news. Her consolations were instantaneous and tender, and she made him realize how vast, though unconscious, a tribute to his greatness the attacks, persecution, and dismissal all were. He had tried to cultivate the indifference she preached, and could have done so had personal dignity alone been involved. But the loss of scientific opportunity was more than he could calmly bear, and he sighed again and again as he repeated how 3 months more of study in the prison might have given him at last the long-sought bacillus which would make all fever a thing of the past. Then Georgina tried another mode of cheering, and told him that surely the prison board would send for him again if the fever did not abate, or if it broke out with increased force. But even this was ineffective, and Clarendon answered only in a string of bitter, ironic, and half-meaningless little sentences, whose tone showed all too clearly how deeply despair and resentment had bitten. Abate? Break out again? Oh, it'll abate all right. At least they'll think it has abated. They think anything, no matter what happens. Ignorant eyes see nothing, and bunglers are never discoverers. Science never shows her face to that sort, and they call themselves doctors. First of all, fancy that ass Jones in charge. Ceasing with a quick sneer, he laughed so demoniacally that Georgina shivered. The days that followed were dismal ones indeed at the Clarendon mansion. Depression, stark and unrelieved, had taken hold of the doctor's usually tireless mind, and he would have even refused food had not Georgina forced it upon him. His great notebook of observations lay unopened on the library table, and his little gold syringe of anti-fever serum, a clever device of his own with a self-contained reservoir attached to a broad gold finger ring and single pressure action peculiar to itself, rested idly in a small leather case beside it. Vigor, ambition, and the desire for study and observation seemed to have died within him, and he made no inquiries about his clinic, where hundreds of germ cultures stood in their orderly vials awaiting his attention. The countless animals held for experiments played, lively and well-fed, in the early spring sunshine, and as Georgina strolled out through the rose arbor to the cages, she felt a strangely incongruous sense of happiness about her. She knew, though, how tragically transient that happiness must be, since the start of new work would soon make all these small creatures unwilling martyrs to science. Knowing this, she glimpsed a sort of compensating element in her brother's inaction, and encouraged him to keep on in a rest he needed so badly. The 8 Tibetan servants moved noiselessly about, each as impeccably effective as usual, and Georgina saw to it that the order of the household did not suffer because of the master's relaxation. Study and starward ambition laid aside in slippered and dressing-gowned indifference, Clarendon was content to let Georgina treat him as an infant. He met her maternal fussiness with a slow, sad smile, and always obeyed her multitude of orders and precepts. A kind of faint, wistful felicity came over the languid household, amidst which the only dissenting note was supplied by Sir Rama. He indeed was miserable, and looked often with sullen and resentful eyes at the sunny serenity in Georgina's
Now I
face.
remember why I
His
don't
only
play
joy
this
had been
one.
the turmoil of experiment, and he missed the routine of seizing the fated animals, bearing them to the clinic in clutching talons, and watching them with hot, brooding gaze and evil chuckles as they gradually fell into the final coma, with wide-open, red-rimmed eyes and swollen tongue lolling from froth-covered mouth.
I remember
Now he was seemingly
now.
driven to desperation by the sight of the carefree creatures in their cages, and frequently came to ask Clarendon if there were any orders. Finding the doctor apathetic and unwilling to begin work, he would go away muttering under his breath and glaring curses upon everything, stealing with cat-like tread to his own quarters in the basement, where his voice would sometimes ascend in deep, muffled rhythms of blasphemous strangeness.
They can't even put fucking...
All this wore on Georgina's nerves, but not by any means so gravely as her brother's continued lassitude itself. The duration
Can you
of the
put
sleep
ammo
alarmed
stack on here?
and little by little she lost the air
On
of
this
cheerfulness
one.
which had so provoked
And it
the
drives
countryman.
me just
Herself, skilled
absolutely
in medicine,
fucking
she found
nuts.
the doctor's condition highly unsatisfactory from an alienist's point of view, and she now feared as much from his absence of interest and activity as she had formerly feared from his fanatical zeal and overstudy. Was lingering melancholy about to turn the once brilliant man of intellect into an innocuous imbecile? Then, toward the end of May, came the sudden change. Georgina always recalled the smallest details connected with it, details as trivial as the box delivered to
Gotta leave
Sarama
for
the day
work.
before,
Alright, Will.
and emitting the most unpleasant odor.
Have a good day
A
at work.
sudden thunderstorm, rare in the extreme for California, sprang up that night as Sarama chanted his
I'm gonna
rituals behind his
see
locked
who's
basement
on.
door in a droning chest voice, louder
Send
and more
everybody
intense than
over
usual.
to,
It was a sunny day, and she had been in the garden gathering
if
flowers
there's
for the dining
anybody
room.
on.
Re-entering the house, she glimpsed her brother in the library, fully dressed and seated at the table, alternately consulting the notes in his thick observation book and making fresh entries with brisk, assured strokes of the pen. He was alert and vital, and there was a satisfying
Yeah,
resilience about his
there's
movements.
people
He
on
now
that
and
we
then
can
turned a
send
page or
everybody to.
reached for a book from the rear of the great table. Delighted and relieved, Georgina hastened to deposit her flowers in the dining room and return. But when she reached the library again, she found that her brother was gone. She knew, of course, that he must be in the...
Thank you for the raids today, by the way. Very much appreciate those. I'm going to send everybody over to DeGrinchy. He is probably working on his servers at the moment, so go show him some support. If I can find him. Let's see. There he is. All right, everybody. Have a wonderful time zone wherever you're at. And remember, at the end of the day, it's just a game. Have fun with it. Till I see y'all later, which I'll be back on later on today or tomorrow morning, however you want to look at it. Till I see you all again, have a wonderful time zone. Love y'all. Peace out. Have a good time. Bye.